For this video, I'm gonna walk through the process of drawing from a grid. The first thing I'm gonna do is start with contour lines. I'm starting with the longest lines that I see. These are gonna be the kind of the outlines of the portrait. It's gonna look like a silhouette maybe. And these are the most general contour lines. So I don't want to get caught up in anything specific. I want to start with the most general. Like I said, the longest lines. And then once I get that silhouette outline, then I'll start working inside of that with more and more specific contour lines. I'll want to find the terminator line, that line that divides the light planes from the shadow planes. And that will start to show me the light side of the portrait and the dark side of the portrait. This is what I'm looking at on my reference image. I'm continuing to work towards more and more specific lines. You can see here I'm starting to address the facial features and some of the smaller shadow lines around the eye. Remember that I'm constantly referring back to the reference image and using the landmarks of the grid lines. For example, that shadow on the cheekbone butts up against the grid line, and so I know exactly where to place it. When I'm referring back to my reference image and the grid, here's exactly what I'm looking at. I can take the height of a grid line and divide it in half and notice that the shadow hits about halfway on that grid line. I can use it to measure the corner of the eye on the other side. And then here's that cheek shadow that I was just talking about, how it pushes up against the grid line and then drops below it. And I can keep doing that for every feature, every shadow line. I just measure its relationship to the grid lines around it. Now is the time that I should be really thinking about proportions as well. I'm using very light marks, and I'm not pushing down. I'm not worrying about going dark or anything. But these light lines will make it easy to erase. So do your erasing at this stage. What I don't want to do is get ahead of myself, start adding value, then realize that my proportions are off, because it's going to be much more difficult to erase. And that's going to cause you a ton of headaches. So worry about your proportions right now at this stage. Continue working with lines as long as you can. Start with those really obvious general lines, keep working more and more specific, and hold off on value for as long as you can for the reason that I just previously stated, because that'll make it much easier to adjust the drawing as you go. I'm starting to get pretty detailed here working on the eyes. Notice how the eyes are perfect circles, how the pupils are perfectly centered within that circle. That's two very important kind of details. And then notice I'm also planning my highlights. That's going to be really useful. Pay attention to the areas of your paper that need to stay white and do everything you can to keep value out of those areas so you can keep those really bright highlights. And that will be a nice effect in the end. This is about as detailed as I'm going to get with my lines. After this point, some of the more subtle details are just going to be small changes in value, so you don't want to overdo this stage. Like I said a bunch of times already, you're just finding lines. So there's your step one, your contour line stage. Now, after this, at this point, I'm going to fill in the shadow side with just a flat value of pretty light shading. I have my pencil sharpened quite a bit there, so there's a lot of graphite exposed. That will allow me to lay my pencil kind of sideways instead of pushing down and indenting the paper. So that's a pretty useful technique that I use throughout this drawing. Here's this block in stage of just filling in value, and as you can see, I'm not worrying about different gradations of value. It's just kind of a flat single value. And then I'll smooth it out real quickly just with a paper towel or something like that. And that's a pretty quick stage. Now I'm going to step 3, adding a full range of values. So now I'm thinking more about like a value scale and getting all the way dark and then keeping my values all the way through white, the paper ground showing. So I'm getting a full range of values, and that will start to create the illusion of form. The stage I'm at right now is filling in that shadow side of the hat with a real dark value, I've grabbed a darker pencil now too. If you notice, I have a different pencil. Now I'm using a 2B at this stage. And then I'm just adding some graphite over that transition line because I want there to be a relatively smooth transition because it's a rounded hat. If I were to leave a really quick transition, then it would start to look like a corner. You can kind of see it, some corners in the top of the hat, and then it's a little bit smoother in the bottom of the hat. I'm moving on to the eye now. One of the reasons that I kind of flew through that hat was because I'm not all that concerned with it. It's not really an important part of the portrait. It's kind of a secondary detail. I'm much more concerned with the facial features. And so this is where I'm going to really dig in and spend some time getting real accurate shading. Accurate shading just means getting as many of those value changes as possible. I'm trying to notice subtle little differences in value. I'm using that 2B pencil to really push the value all the way dark. I'm trying to keep my lights all the way light. I'm using the brush a little bit more. I'm using an eraser a little bit more to keep those highlights. I am not necessarily worried with surface level detail at this point. I'm primarily occupied with matching value as closely as I can. Another important thing to notice here is that I'm staying in one area. I'm working in one area. I'm not jumping all around the portrait doing the left eye, half of the right eye, a little bit of a nostril, because that can get overwhelming to approach a drawing like that. I find that it's much easier to focus on one small area and not jump around too much. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm just working on that one side. Now I'm gonna jump across to the other side. I'm gonna work in the light plane. And this takes a little bit of a different approach compared to the shadow. Notice my value is being added with a brush. I'm very careful that I'm not laying down harsh marks in the light plane because I want a lot of the paper to show through. I want a lot of light value on that light side. So if I'm making too many pencil marks, I'm adding too much value. I'm using the brush, but you do still have to pay attention to how much graphite is in the end of the brush. You can take some off. A lot of times I'll just reach over into some of the shadow areas and pick up some dust and bring it over. Or if I make a couple lines or a couple marks with my pencil like I just did on that eyelid line, and then I go over that eyelid line with my brush, I'll be able to push and move that value around and smooth it out a little bit. So I'm only adding pencil marks where I need those real dark values. Otherwise, I'm relying a little bit more on my brush in this light plane. As I'm progressing through this stage where it's getting kind of close to finished, I'm making sure to erase my grid lines as I go too. So if you notice in this row that I'm working in with the eyes, there are no grid lines in there. I kind of have already erased those. You see some in the cheek still. But I'm getting ready to finish. This is where this step 4 is basically a finishing stage, refining values, adding details. And I'm being really precise and kind of thinking of this pass as a finishing pass and trying to bring it to completion and then move on to different parts of the drawing. Like I kind of talked about earlier, that can be a way to not be overwhelmed, not feel like you have a ton left in the drawing. I can think of this as like I've already pretty much finished the top half of the portrait. Now I just have the bottom half of the portrait. Notice how I have handled the eyebrows and the eyelashes. They are very subtle. I did not illustrate them with lines. That's a common mistake that people make is they overemphasize those details. I'm just using value. There's just subtle differences in value that give you enough of the texture. So don't get too caught up in making 100 lines for an eyebrow or trying to draw every individual eyelash. You don't want to ignore them. I'm not saying they're not important. I'm just saying that you don't want to overly fixate on them or overly emphasize them. I would consider that row complete, and now I'm just going to repeat steps 1 through 4 throughout the drawing. I'm working from the top down. The primary reason I'm doing that is so that I'm not dragging my hand through value that I just lay down. So if I'm right-handed, I'm working from the top left to the bottom right, and I would just do the opposite. If I was left-handed, I'd work from the top right to the bottom left. As I start drawing my mouth area, I have to start worrying about hair again. Things that I just said about the eyebrow are still true. It's very important to think of hair as a three-dimensional form and address it with value. Try not to think of hair as individual strands of hair, because thinking of it as those individual strands will entice people to render it with a whole bunch of lines, and that's not necessarily the way to approach it. You want to try to continue approaching it with value as long as you can, and worry about those surface textures later, right? That's just kind of like a finishing detail. I'm back working on the light side of the drawing now, kind of jumping around and working my way down, adding those finishing touches. So finishing the nose, finishing the cheek, and once I do that, I want to do that before I come back and finish the mouth area. So that's why I kind of jump back up there. As I'm finishing the mouth, a couple things to think about. Another common mistake that people make is they try to outline the lips. Remember that your lips are just forms. There's some lines to see. There's the center line. There's definitely a line there. There's a line on the bottom of the lip, but that doesn't go all the way around it perfectly. You only see lines where there's dramatic difference in values. And so there's a big drop off underneath the lip. And so you do see a little bit of a line there. That top lip is facing down, so the top lip's going to be darker than the bottom lip. The bottom lip is facing up. This final stage, I'm getting some of that surface texture that I was saying to hold off on. And I'm doing that by erasing. So remember that the pencil line creates a shadow. So you can't draw individual strands of hair, you draw shadows. And then I'll use the eraser to make some of those light marks and some of those little highlighted strands of hair. The goal of this technique is to communicate texture, but to remain relatively subtle. And so this is an approach that I like. I'm finishing up with a little strap for the hat, and that's going to be about it. Notice how I did not fully render the edges of the portrait. The ear is a little bit faded, the hat doesn't have a ton of detail. The shirt and the bandana are in like that second stage where it's a block in and you see the rough marks. And this helps emphasize the important parts of the drawing, the facial features. And it allows me to not get caught up in some parts of the drawing that may not be as interesting, like, who cares about a wrinkle in the shirt? Another little trick to pay attention to is look at the parts of the drawing that are completely in shadows. The underside of the hat, the left ear, the left cheek. Notice how they are a step lighter than that very dark value of the Terminator line. This allows that corner to come forward, and it allows the other parts in the shadow to recede. And it also allows the viewer to kind of not worry about them because they're in shadow and you don't see any detail on them. So that's just a little kind of trick of how to handle the shadow areas. All right, you got the basic steps 1 through 4. Contour lines, blocking in, full range of values, refining values, adding detail. I also try to give you some tips and tricks along the way. I think that you guys are ready to give this a try on your own now. Good luck.